Now read a second time. I call the member for Newtown.
Thank you, Mr Assistant Speaker. I rise to speak on behalf of the Greens on the Crimes, Domestic and Personal Violence Amendment National Domestic Violence Orders Recognition Bill 2016 and offer the Greens support for this bill, which will create a process for new domestic violence orders known as Apprehended Domestic Violence Orders, or ADVOs, in New South Wales, from New South Wales to be recognised in other states and jurisdictions, and similarly for us to recognise those from other states. While currently there is a framework for mutual recognition of these apprehended domestic violence orders across states, this must be initiated by the victim or survivor through a court process, and this bill will seek to address the need for that to occur. I would like to address briefly two key issues in relation to this bill and more generally on the need for the action to eliminate violence against women. The first relates directly to this bill and the issue of enforcement. Given that it would be expected that a much larger number of ADVOs will be needed to be assessed, it's crucial to be reassured and for the community to be reassured that there are additional resources and adequate systems in place to be able to ensure confidence and effectiveness of this new approach. And as such, I would ask the Attorney-General to provide more detail to the Parliament about how this enforcement will be undertaken, how breaches will be dealt with, and what mechanisms will be put in place to ensure that the public can have a confidence in this system and its effectiveness working across jurisdictions, and ensure that it is adequately resourced. The second relates to the need to ensure that we don't just rely on a justice response to respond to the serious issues of domestic violence. This law comes from a model law adopted by COAG in December 2015, and while it recognises that New South Wales is the first state to take action, while it is recognised and we recognise that the New South Wales Government is the first state to take action on these and to try and implement these laws, it is important to note that the impact of this change will not come into effect until all of the laws have passed in other states also. And so while we welcome this reform, which is a logical step to handle the serious issue of domestic violence across jurisdictions and state boundaries and borders, given the seriousness and urgency of this issue of violence against women in our communities, it is crucial that we don't just limit our response to a justice response, but also that we undertake the adequate investment and holistic approach to ensure that we are preventing and eliminating the violence that occurs against women and children. We need to ensure that priority is given, as my colleague, the member for Balmain, spoke earlier, that priority is given to victim and survivor support, as well as investing in changing community attitudes. It is highly questionable whether this New South Wales Government is actually leading the way when it comes to prioritising these other important areas. And so it is important that when we see a plan for eliminating domestic violence and family violence against women, that we recognise the need to ensure that there is an approach that is integrated, coordinated and collaborative, and that we take the cycle of violence and we actually work to eliminate the root causes of that violence. The Greens have long said that in addition to a justice response, we also need to see an investment in violence prevention initiatives across all parts of society, including communities, schools, workplaces, businesses, sport and recreation settings, as well as in the media, funding targeted education programs from early childhood through to high school, and building awareness of issues around gender stereotyping, inequality and attitudes encouraging violence, and funding community and workplace-based initiatives to prevent violence and foster respect and respectful and equal relationships between men and women. We need to be looking at restoring and increasing funding to women-only specialist services, refuges and shelters, especially in rural and regional areas. We need to look at programs specific to addressing the issues of domestic violence with Aboriginal and migrant communities, as well as ensuring that we're investing in trauma and informed support services for women and children that support and enable healing, including accommodation and post-crisis services. We also need to ensure that we're investing in the skills development for communities workers that are on the front line of addressing issues of violence and working with victims and survivors of domestic violence and their families. We must move up the cycle of violence and invest significantly in preventative strategies and programs to identify and support those most at risk. Speaking in May 2015, my Greens colleague in the other place, Maureen Faruqi, our spokesperson on women and domestic violence, and Family Violence said, and I quote, "In New South Wales, the rate of domestic violence-related assaults rose by 1.9% between 2009 and 2013. Domestic and family violence is the leading cause of death, ill health and disability amongst women aged under 45 in Australia, and we can no longer ignore the fact that this type of violence is reaching epidemic proportions in this country." She goes on to say, "The uncomfortable truth is that we will only be able to tackle domestic violence in a meaningful way when we acknowledge that it's fundamentally gendered nature and we implement programs that address ingrained and prejudicial attitudes towards power and gender in society." Violence against women is not inevitable. It is a human rights violation and it is something that we can work together to eliminate. But we can only do that if we address the root causes of how this violence is perpetrated and ensure that we recognise that having a holistic approach to responding to this urgent mission is the only way that we will address it. This includes having a justice response, as the bill before us today moves to do, as well as ensuring that there is proper investment and adequate support for victim and survivor support, as well as a recognition that there is a need to change community attitudes. This is an issue that impacts on all women in our community and our society. It is an issue that impacts on many, many families, and it is something that we need to continue to urgently address in a bipartisan way across the chamber.
Member Speaker.